Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming today on a Saturday. We all really appreciate it, and I'm delighted to be surrounded by wastewater and water lovers, and I hope you all are too, or will leave today feeling that way. So yeah, I've spent the last 10 years working at the London School of Economics. So although I see myself as a sort of a designer, I research and I teach, and at LSE City sits underneath the Department of Sociology and Social Policy, which is a really comfortable place, I think, for the work that I'm going to show you. I set up a program called the Young Researchers and Residents, which is the sort of core work that I'm taking forward. And I'm not going to show that to you today, but I did want to briefly mention it. And because that's where we work with young people and try to connect young people to development in their areas. Because I think, to echo what Indy was talking about, there's nothing more disempowering than feeling that change is happening at you and not with you. I've recently left the LSE. I now run my own outfit called Julia King and Associates, and we really specialize in brief development, working with communities and participatory design. We use spatial tools to kind of ask difficult questions and get people involved. And what underpins all of my work, I think, and the work that I show you today, I think, yeah, I'm not going to deviate, is a question of, does design have a role to play in addressing issues of urban inequality? And I think also thinking about what Indy was talking about today, questions of social justice. And for me, that has been a practice of actually unthinking architecture, unlearning assumptions. And in doing that, have developed a body of work of rethinking infrastructure as design. And so, for those of you who are not from the UK or don't read newspapers, we have a crisis brewing in our seas and in our rivers. So last year, every day, 1,000 times every day, sewage was dumped into our UK waters. In 2022, 2.7 million hours of sewage was dumped into our beaches and into our rivers. And that's what we know about. So and at this moment, I want to say it's worth reflecting that the highest reductions recorded in the last century of sort of mortality came about through the advent of water and piped sewage in Europe and America. And that's what this regression makes this so galling. And this is something I've been looking at thanks to sort of funding from the AHRC. And upstairs, I've got an exhibition alongside with other people speaking today, and it's 4 design research proposals that would like to tackle this problem. And it's important to say that these are meant to be ideas to seek provocations, to seek questions, and to ask questions and seek kind of responses to them. And I don't pretend in any way, shape, or form that these are novel or even radical, and that's potentially the problem. But to tell that story of the exhibition upstairs, I need to take you back in time to 2011, when I had the privilege to return to India to do a PhD. I grew up in India, so it's a country I love very much. And my PhD took me to this place. It's called Savdagevra, and it's on the edge of Delhi. And it's a planned settlement. And so in that, the state, in the run-up to the Commonwealth Games, moved many people from the inner city to peripheral settlements like this. And it's called site and services, but the reality is that there's no services. Each plot would have electricity, but there was no piped water and no sewage. And the residents were given a degree of tenure, and the theory was that then, that would trigger investment. And so most people did, and you can see the variation in house types, would build according to their own capacity and needs, often using local labor and so on. And I arrived to Savda as a young, sort of aspiring architect, and very much thought I was going to be doing housing. And so my field work was looking at the accelerators and barriers to the housing economy. And through my survey, I developed this spectrum, this graphic, and started recording the housing types that existed. And the real challenge that I could immediately see was that most houses, 95% of them, were single-story. But the more problematic thing was that 50% of them were single-story, but without the capacity to grow up. And that ability to go up that sort of spectrum, to have room for, let's say, a shop or for a rental, that's the name of the game. And this incremental mode of city making is how the urban poor throughout the world reclaim their rights to the city. It's by building, by fortifying, and by consolidating. And so, quickly through my survey work, I came to understand this critical transition that these photographs showed. So this is the same plot, years apart. So in 2010, when I first arrived to Savda Gevra, you could see the family, they kind of cook and wash outside and would defecate in a field nearby. I came back the next year and was sort of blown away by this house that now has a toilet in it. And you can see it there. And actually, I've continued to go back to this place. So in 2016, the house made another story and another toilet and beautifully tiled it with a beautifully tiled house. And this is a transition often triggered by a young girl coming of age or a family, a sort of a bride entering into the home. And it's really triggered around the addition of a toilet. And it's really important to contextualize this of people doing for themselves, because this was the formal provision. This was a community toilet block back in 2011. And at the time, there was about one latrine for every 250 women. And actually, as you can see, even those latrines that were sort of working, it's in a really, it's not in a good state. And the reality was that most people defecated in the open or figured out what to do. And so this figuring out, in the absence of the state, in the absence of the market, would involve putting a tank underneath your home. And that tank would hold all the waste, the sewage. And at some point, you would get a honeysucker, is what they're called, to come and suck the shit out. This is very expensive, though. And it was here in this moment that I started working with an incredible local NGO called CURE, the Center for Urban and Regional Excellence. And we started a project to develop sanitation in this poor, peripheral, and disconnected place. And much of the communication, I really loved the images from Ooze. I'm a huge fan of their work. And because the reality of this kind of work is this. It's community meetings, it's sitting and listening and staying a while and listening to the less powerful. And this was one of the really basic models I made, which showed how houses that had made that investment already, how they could disconnect and connect into this shared system, and houses who didn't have a toilet, what they would do. So red straws was houses with toilets, and blue was houses without. And this is, to steal a term from the amazing anthropologist Arjuna Padarai, this is the politics of patience, of kind of the dynamic of working with communities. And there's a serious point that is there's so much to learn from them, not just in terms of management or the nature of waste and flood patterns and so on, but also these are the people who, in the absence of the state, have actually done the most already. So we have to listen to them if we're interested in finding solutions. And one of the most critical things we established at the time was this all-woman operation and maintenance team who were trained in project management, procurement, and finance, and ended up actually procuring the build. And to steal, again, another Padarai term, the politics of shit, was turned on its head, where the humiliation and victimization of defecating in an open field was turned on its head into technical powers and sort of self-dignification. And it's perhaps this that I am still most proud of today, of what we achieved all the way back then. At the time, of all the people who practiced open defecation in the world, 50% of those were in India. And I found it incredibly frustrating statistic when I felt that the solutions for this problem, we already had them. For $50,000, we completed this project, and a fair amount of that, that's, for those of you who think that's a lot of money, it's not. It's, that was a big, long project, and the problem was political will. And that's where India has gone some way to fixing that horrific stat. But there is another problem, and perhaps the point of this talk, it's how we as a society see infrastructure. So this was a practice of architecture that was promising, not because it delivered infrastructure, but precisely because it was a practice willing to get entangled into the politics of everyday life, seeing infrastructure not as a pipework, not as a static thing or object, but as a complex social and technological process that can enable or disable life and love in the city. So infrastructure can become a driver for change. It can drive women's empowerment. It can drive public space. And so now I want to take the last minutes to draw our attention to the UK. So what you see there are active discharges And so if it's not clear, I showed you the India work because everything I learned about sewage, I learned 10 years on that kind of work. And I had the privilege to bring that to the UK, something I never thought I was ever going to do in my career. And this is why. So this was just taken, when I prepared this presentation, I whipped open my favorite websites because I do sea swim. And those were sewage dumping in London, and that's on the coast. I live on the North Kent coast. And you can see there was sewage dumping through those. And you can check out these maps yourself. Incredible organizations, the River Trust and Surfers Against Sewage. And I again want to be really clear. This is first and foremost not a design problem. It's a political problem. And it's galling the lack of accountability and responsibility we have right now. And until that, nothing will change. However, that political incompetence, that criminality of the water companies, I do believe is propped up by a lack of creative ideas, a lack of creative thinking, and a system that looks towards the existing system for solutions rather than looking elsewhere. And that ends up being a series of never-ending pipes going further out into the sea, just extending the problem for another generation. And why I say that is that this is the system working how it's meant to. So most of our sewage infrastructure system is 150 years old. And by design, when it rains a lot, so those in the UK would remember the extraordinary amount of rain we've been having, by design, the system acts like there's an overflow. So this is like an emergency relief valve that you should all be grateful for, because alternatively, that sewage would back up through your toilets and into your homes. I have seen this happen in India. But the point is this is meant to happen only in exceptional circumstances. And exception it isn't. So I've now added onto the slide 19th of August, which was a beautiful, glorious summer day when it hadn't been raining. And this is an example, and it's actually quite an unsavory term, of a dry discharge. So dry discharges are during dry periods or before a treatment plant has reached its minimum treatment rate. And again, the frustrating thing is that we have solutions to this problem. And that's the sort of exhibit that I have upstairs, and I invite you to look at them. And I'm going to now show you two of them really briefly, and I'm going to take you to those two X's in that yellow square on that slide of the 19th. So the first place is Long Rock. It's a beautiful nature reserve, and it's a site of scientific interest, and it's right next to a sewage treatment plant, which you can see on that Google Earth image. And that sewage treatment plant often overflows into the brook. And it's a really simple proposal, which effectively would see this area go from an unmanaged wetland to a managed wetland. And it's using the same details, actually, that I used in Savdagevra. And this intervention would see this reserve be filled with reed beds and stabilization ponds, sand and gravel filters, and all of that would treat the wastewater. And nestled within this new natural treatment plant is a tidal pool. And here what we're trying to say is to push this idea of what infrastructure for public good looks like, asking how investment, when it comes, isn't just fixing this effluent crisis, but actually adding social, cultural, and civic contributions and connecting us as citizens back to our waste and making us think about it. So this is just a quick collage, which was a way that I was working, referencing projects that have inspired that intervention. And I'm running out of time. I promised I wouldn't, so I'm going to power through this. This is the second intervention, which is about the power of the oyster. So we have cultivated oysters in the UK since the 1400s, but actually it's now today one of the most under threat habitats that's lost. We've lost 95% of our oyster habitats, which is a whole other story of the damage that's happening to our country. And the amazing thing about the oyster is that the single oyster can filter 150 liters of water a day. And weirdly, we as humans a single human will produce roughly around that every day. So this idea of a 1-for-1 is a really powerful concept. And so this proposal imagines this sort of oyster reef along the entire North Kent coast, taking inspiration from the amazing $1 billion oyster project, which develops these oyster catchers which they can grow on. And all of this would appear and disappear with the tide. And for me, there's so many parallels of this project and the Savda project. And so to wrap up, the point that I'm trying to make is that we have never had to think about our infrastructure because of its largely invisible and hence normalized qualities. And it's now in this moment of such catastrophic a public breakdown that we can ask these questions. And so that's the intention of the project. And I might, just as my last comment, I think it might be worth reminding our politicians that one of the recognized causes of the Paris uprising of 1832, famously dramatized in Les Mis, was a disgust with the mismanagement of the Paris sewers. Victor Hugo uses the mismanagement of the sewer as a metaphor for how society discards and stigmatizes people. For him, the sewer is the conscience of the city. Thank you very much.